Hesperis was a world caught between destruction and hope, a planet of towering red skies and scorched landscapes, its surface scarred by the constant tremors of an unstable core. Beneath the brutal exterior, however, the planet thrived with a fragile life force, a life force guarded by ancient creatures as old as the planet itself. Humanity's colony on Hesperis had only one line of defense: colossal mechs, towering giants of metal and technology, created to battle the terrifying kaiju that emerged from the depths of the planet's heart. They were humanity's shield, and within their armored shells, two pilots became the last beacon of hope. Captain Riley Shaw was the leader of the beacon, one of the most powerful mechs ever constructed. Her reputation was built on battle strategies that defied odds, but inside her she carried a brokenness, a weight of loss and a bitterness for a war that seemed endless. Alongside her was Jaxon Lee, her engineer, a brilliant mind whose detachment made him an enigma. Together, they were an unlikely pair, and yet they had become each other's anchor in the chaos. But as they fought to protect their colony, neither could deny the growing sense that something wasn't right. The kaiju were not the mindless monsters they had been led to believe. They were guardians, protectors of the very thing that powered the beacon and every other mech, the unstable core of Hesperis. And in the end, that power might not just be their greatest weapon, it might also be their undoing. The roar of the beacon's engines vibrated through Riley Shaw's bones as she stood at the cockpit's controls. The massive mech, standing taller than the highest city spires, rumbled in synchronization with the pulse of her heart. It was as if the machine had become an extension of her body, the movement fluid, instinctive, the battle strategies second nature. The battlefield stretched out before her, a desolate wasteland where jagged mountains rose like the teeth of some ancient beast, and the ground cracked with tremors that reverberated in the very air. "Hitting the signal, Captain." Jaxon Lee's voice came over the comms, his tone flat, devoid of any real emotion. Riley glanced at the readout. Jaxon had already lined up the energy grid for a strike. They were ready for the creatures. "Make it count, Jax," she replied, her voice steady but the weight of the coming battle hanging over her words. Jackson's hands flew over the console in front of him, his fingers an intricate dance of precision and speed. Riley watched him for a moment, noting how detached he was, even now. His face was as unreadable as ever, the flickering lights of the cockpit's dashboard throwing shadows over his features. He was brilliant, but there was always something distant about him, a quiet that wasn't born of shyness, but of pain. A sharp beep interrupted her thoughts. Targets incoming. Riley's attention snapped back to the screens in front of her. On the horizon, through the swirling dust and ash of Hesperis' battered surface, she saw the shapes emerge, massive, hulking beasts that seemed to be made of the very rock and bone of the planet itself. Their eyes glowed with a faint luminescence, their claws glinting like knives as they advanced in unison. "Here we go," she muttered under her breath. "Deploying defenses," Jaxon said, and the mech's massive arms shifted, preparing for battle. The creatures weren't mindless beasts, as they once believed. Riley had seen them, huge loping figures with armored exteriors, the earth shuddering beneath their steps. The first time they fought one, she had barely survived the encounter. Now, after months of brutal engagements, she had learned how to fight them, how to predict their movements, how to exploit their weaknesses. But something in her gut told her that this time would be different. The first kaiju reached them with terrifying speed, its bellow splitting the air. Riley's fingers clenched around the controls, guiding the beacon into a defensive stance. With a roar, the mech surged forward, its colossal foot stomping into the earth, leaving a crater in its wake. The battle had begun. The beacon's plasma. Cannons fired in unison, each shot sending bright blue beams streaking toward the kaiju. The creature staggered back but didn't fall. It was too resilient. too powerful. Shifting left, Riley commanded. She angled the mech's torso just as the kaiju swung its enormous tail toward them, smashing into the ground with a deafening crack. The force of the blow sent shockwaves through the mech, rattling Riley's teeth and forcing her to brace herself against the controls. Too close, Jaxon muttered, his hands working quickly to stabilize the energy output. Riley didn't respond, her eyes focused entirely on the creature before her. She could feel the heat of its fiery breath even through the reinforced steel of the beacon's frame. The kaiju lunged again, and this time Riley reacted faster. She gripped the throttle, bringing the mech's giant fist crashing into the creature's jaw. It recoiled, and she followed up with another strike, this time to its chest. The creature staggered back, its glowing eyes narrowing in a way that almost seemed intelligent. That was the moment when doubt began to creep into Riley's mind. She had faced kaiju like this before, but none had ever shown such awareness. They were always mindless, driven by pure instinct. These ones, they were different. "Captain, there's something off about these ones," Jaxon said suddenly, his voice no longer so neutral. There was a note of confusion in it now. "They're not just attacking us, they're protecting something." "What are you talking about?" Riley snapped, more out of reflex than any true anger. Her eyes never left the kaiju before her, which had just recovered and was preparing another charge. "They're not coming for the colony," Jaxon explained, his tone urgent now. "They're coming for us, because of the power source. They're trying to keep us from draining the core." The ground trembled beneath them as a second kaiju appeared, flanking the first. Riley's breath caught in her chest. This was no random assault. The creatures weren't just defending against invaders. They were guarding something they couldn't understand. "Keep pushing forward, Jaxon," Riley ordered, but even she could hear the uncertainty creeping into her own voice. "We have to protect the colony. This isn't about us anymore." But deep down, she knew this fight was about much more than just the creatures. It was about the core, the very heart of Hesperis, the energy that fueled their mechs, their defenses, their survival. And at what cost? Another impact sent the beacon sprawling across the ground. Riley's mind raced, piecing together a growing revelation. The kaiju weren't simply attacking, they were trying to stop them from taking what belonged to the planet. And in the midst of it all, Riley could feel it. The planet itself fighting back, even as the tremors continued to shake the very core beneath them. The fight was only beginning, but what would happen when the truth of the battle came to light? The impact of the kaiju's tail felt like the planet itself was shaking under the beacon's feet. Riley's grip tightened on the controls as the ground buckled beneath the massive mech. The jolt almost sent them both into a tailspin, but Riley's hands were steady, more steady than she felt inside. The world outside the cockpit was chaos. Ash swirling, the rumble of the kaiju's roars, and the distant sounds of other mechs engaging in battle further down the valley. Jaxon's voice came, through her earpiece, crisp and urgent. "We've got an energy feedback spike. You're overloading the system, Captain. We need to recalibrate the core." His words were more technical than emotional, but Riley could hear the tension beneath them. It had been like this for months. Jaxon, buried in the mechanics of it all, fixing, adjusting, always watching the numbers, never allowing himself to break. But Riley knew the truth. He didn't just fear for their survival, he feared losing himself in the battle. "Not now, Jaxon!" Riley snapped back, focusing on the kaiju whose eyes were glowing a bright, unnatural green. She didn't have time for recalibration. Every second counted, every breath could be their last. The first kaiju swung its massive claw toward the beacon, aiming for the cockpit. Riley yanked the throttle hard, throwing the mech's weight to the left. The kaiju's talons missed by mere inches, but the impact of its strike caused the mech to stumble. It wasn't just the force, it was the precision of the creatures. Attack! This wasn't the kind of mindless creature she had fought before. "Jaxon," she said, voice a little softer this time, a crack in her usual confidence. "I need the core recalibrated. Now." Jaxon didn't respond immediately. The hum of the machine echoed in the quiet that followed, and Riley could sense that something had shifted between them. It wasn't just the battle anymore. It wasn't just about fighting for survival. There was a deeper question gnawing at both of them. "Recalibrating," Jaxon finally said. She could hear his fingers flying over the console, his usual calm back in his voice. But this time, there was something else. A faint crackle in the air, a subtle but present sense of foreboding. Riley didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed glued to the screens, watching as the second kaiju charged in, moving like liquid shadow over the terrain. This one was faster, more agile, its limbs bent and twisted unnaturally, as though it had no bones, only raw power. The first kaiju made another move, this time swinging its tail in a wide arc. Riley ducked, instinctively guiding the mech to avoid the blow. The tail slammed into the earth with a roar, creating a shockwave that rattled the beacon's systems. Sparks flew from the console in front of her, and the cockpit flickered with static. The air grew thick with dust, but Riley's vision remained locked on the creatures. "They're getting faster," Riley muttered under her breath. "Too fast for the standard combat protocols," Jaxon replied. "This isn't right. These creatures are evolving." "Don't say that," Riley said sharply, shaking her head. "We don't have time for theories, Jax. Focus." She slammed her fist against the panel, activating the mech's anti-kaiju weaponry. The plasma cannons whined as they powered up, their barrels glowing with energy. She fired. The kaiju roared in pain as the plasma blast struck its side, but it didn't stagger back. Instead, it lurched forward even faster, seemingly unfazed. Jackson's voice was quieter this time. "They're not acting like normal kaiju. It's like they're..." He trailed off, and Riley felt a shiver run down her spine. His words hung in the air, unspoken but heavy with implication. Before she could respond, the ground beneath them shook again. This time, it wasn't just the tremors of the kaiju. It was something deeper, something the planet itself was sending through the surface. The core was reacting. Riley could feel it through the mech's systems, a pull in the air, a charge that hummed louder in her ears. "Captain, the core's destabilizing faster than expected," Jaxon said. His voice was tight, and Riley could hear the sound of frantic typing in the background. "If we don't recalibrate soon, we're going to overload the power grid." Riley gritted her teeth. The last thing she needed was a system failure right now, but the reality was creeping in. If they didn't stop fighting, if they didn't stop using the core's energy to power their mechs, Hesperis would be doomed. The creatures weren't the only thing threatening the planet's survival. But the mission came first. Always. Another kaiju charged toward them, its massive jaws snapping with a primal rage. Riley moved fast, sidestepping its attack, and brought the beacon's massive fist down with a brutal punch that sent the kaiju tumbling backward. But just as quickly, the creature righted itself and struck back with its claw. The impact sent a wave of pressure through the cockpit, rattling the mech's bones and throwing Riley off balance. "Jaxon!" she shouted, struggling to regain control. "The mech systems were starting to flicker unstable." "We're running out of time." Jackson's fingers flew over the console, his concentration absolute. "I've got it. Recalibrating the core now," he said, his voice a bit strained. Just as the systems came back online, the first kaiju lunged, its claws aimed directly for the cockpit. Riley gritted her teeth and threw the throttle into overdrive, dodging just as the massive claws sliced through the air where she had been. The mech skidded to the side, feet scraping against the earth. The second kaiju wasn't far behind. It moved with terrifying speed, charging in for another strike. This time, Riley didn't dodge. Instead, she swung the beacon into position and fired the railguns mounted on its shoulders. The shot hit the kaiju directly in the chest, sending it tumbling back with a deafening roar, but it wasn't enough. The first kaiju recovered, its eyes locking with hers through the haze of smoke and dust. It was moving differently now, its movements, purposeful, coordinated. Riley felt a chill creep down her spine. She could see the intelligence in its eyes, the calm determination, and then, for a brief moment, she felt something shift. "Jaxon," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. "This isn't a fight. It's a warning." Jackson's fingers paused. "On the console. What do you mean? The kaiju? They're not just attacking us, they're trying to protect something." Before Jaxon could respond, the ground shook again, harder this time, and Riley braced herself. A new tremor rippled. Through the air, deeper and more ominous. The kaiju weren't just fighting, they were rallying, drawing strength from something beneath the surface, something they were guarding. And in that moment, Riley knew that the battle was far from over. What they were facing wasn't just a physical war, it was a war for the very life of Hesperis itself. The battle raged on around them, but Riley Shaw's focus had shifted. The kaiju, massive, relentless, continued their assault. But now, something deeper stirred within her. She wasn't just fighting to protect humanity. No, something had changed. In her understanding of what was really at stake, the creatures weren't mindless monsters. They weren't just enemies, they were protectors. But protectors of what? "Captain, are you hearing me?" Jackson's voice crackled through the comm, snapping her back to the present. She glanced at the readouts in front of her. The beacon was still holding up, but the readings were fluctuating wildly. The core was unstable. The creatures were attacking with unprecedented coordination, like a swarm of sentient beings working in unison. There was a purpose behind their movements, a purpose that didn't match anything they'd been told. "Yeah, Jaxon, I hear you," she replied, her voice hoarse as the words left her lips. "But I'm not sure what I'm hearing anymore." He didn't respond right away. The sounds of his frantic keystrokes filled the silence between them, but when he spoke again, his tone was different, concerned, even anxious. "Something's wrong, Captain," Jaxon said. "The creatures are targeting the power grid. They're trying to shut it down. And the core..." He paused, his voice faltering for the first time Riley could remember. "The core is connected to the kaiju." Riley blinked, momentarily stunned. She knew the energy they were drawing from the planet was vital to keeping humanity alive. She knew that their mechs, their last defense, were powered by the very heart of Hesperis itself. But the idea that the kaiju were not just attacking, they were trying to protect the core, hadn't occurred to her until now. "Explain," she demanded, her voice steel in contrast to the growing unease in her stomach. The battle raged on, but it felt far away now. She couldn't focus on the fight in front of her if there were bigger questions to answer. Jackson's hands flew over the console, pulling up various schematics and data logs from the planet's core and the energy flow through the mech systems. "I've been going over the core's data, Captain. The energy that powers the beacon, it's not just fuel, it's life force. The planet's life force." Riley's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, life force?" "The core of Hesperis, it's not just a power source for our mechs. It's the planet's energy, its pulse. And those kaiju, they're not just mindless monsters. They're guardians, ancient ones perhaps, created to protect the core. The creature's movements, the way they're attacking, it's not random. They're trying to stop us from draining the core. They're trying to keep the balance intact." Riley's breath caught in her throat. Her mind raced, trying to process this new information. "Are you saying the creatures, the ones we've been fighting, they're trying to protect Hesperis?" "Yes," Jaxon said, his voice tight with urgency. "And it's worse than we thought. The more we drain the core to power the mechs, the more unstable the planet becomes. We're tipping it into a collapse." Riley's hands tightened on the controls, the weight of the revelation sinking in like a stone in her stomach. The beacon groaned beneath her, the mech systems already running hot from the constant strain of battle. She glanced at the readout. The core's energy output was spiking again, the flow unstable. They were barely holding things together. "Stop!" Riley barked, the command coming out more sharply than she intended. "Jaxon, shut down the power grid, now!" "I can't," Jaxon replied, frustration tinging his tone. "It's tied to the mech systems. If I disconnect now, we risk a total system failure. We'll be defenseless. But if we don't stop using the core's energy, the planet will implode," Riley said, her voice shaking now as the enormity of the situation hit her full force. "You have to find another way, Jaxon. We can't keep doing this." Jaxon's silence stretched, the only sound in the cockpit the low hum of the beacon's failing systems. Finally he spoke again, his voice quieter, tinged with a kind of bitter clarity. "If we don't stop, if we keep using the core, the kaiju will kill us all. But if we stop using it, the planet dies anyway. We're running out of options." Riley's heart ached. The weight of leadership, the weight of responsibility, pressed down on her chest like 1,000 tons. Her job was to protect humanity, to make sure they survived, but at what cost? The truth was staring her in the face, and she couldn't ignore it anymore. The planet wasn't just a battleground. It was alive. It had its own pulse, its own rhythm, and they had been exploiting that life force for their own survival. She exhaled, her mind spinning as she tried to reconcile the impossible choices before her. The kaiju weren't attacking them because they were enemies. They were protecting the core, protecting the life of Hesperis itself. Hesperis. "We've been wrong this whole time," Riley muttered, more to herself than to Jaxon. "The kaiju, they're not the real threat. We are." "We've been using the planet like a battery," Jaxon said, his voice quiet but firm. "And now the planet is fighting back." Riley's eyes hardened. She couldn't deny it. Every battle she'd fought, every time the beacon had surged forward to fight the kaiju, they had been draining Hesperis, one strike at a time. The creatures had only been doing what they were made to do, protect their home. The cockpit hummed. Ominously, the warning lights flashing. Riley's fingers hovered over the controls, torn between two conflicting forces. One part of her urged her to keep fighting, to finish what they'd started, to keep the colony safe. The other part, the part that had always trusted her instincts, urged her to stop before it was too late. A new kaiju appeared in the distance, larger and more formidable than the ones they had fought before. It moved toward them with purpose, its glowing eyes locked on the beacon. Riley's stomach tightened. It was almost as if the creature knew exactly what they were thinking, and just like the others, it wasn't mindlessly charging them. It was protecting something. "The kaiju are closing in," Jaxon said, his voice tense. "If we don't do something fast, we'll be overwhelmed." Riley didn't respond right away. She stared at the oncoming kaiju, its form becoming clearer as it advanced through the haze of smoke. Its massive rocky limbs churned the earth beneath it. A low rumble shook the cockpit as it drew nearer. Then, Riley made a decision. "Jaxon, I'm going to try something," she said, her voice low but resolute. "We're going to stop fighting, but we need to know more about the core, and fast. Can you tap into the colony's research archives? I need to understand what's really going on here." "Already on it," Jaxon replied, his fingers a blur across the console. "I'll get you the data, but Captain, we don't have long." Riley glanced at the kaiju, watching as it slowed its approach, as if waiting for something. Her pulse quickened as she realized that whatever came next would decide not just their future, but the future of Hesperis itself. "I know," she said quietly. "I know." The air inside the beacon felt colder now, not because of the external battle or the growing tremors beneath their feet, but because of the realization that was slowly sinking in. Riley Shaw had always believed that the war was straightforward. The kaiju were the enemy. The core was the resource. The mechs were the only way to protect humanity, and that was all there was to it. But now, after everything, the lines had blurred, and the truth was more complex and more dangerous than she had ever imagined. She leaned back in her seat, taking in the dim glow of the cockpit's control panel as the war outside raged on. The kaiju were closing in, but Riley was no longer focused solely on them. She was focused on the mission, yes, but more than that, she was focused on understanding the root cause of this conflict. Why had the kaiju attacked in the first place? Why had they been guarding the core, the very thing that powered the beacon and its mechs? "Jaxon," Riley said quietly, her voice taut with resolve. "What's the status on the archive data?" There was a moment of silence before Jackson's voice came through, calm and efficient. "Pulling up the files now. It's going to take a minute to sift through it. Some of the archives are encrypted, but I'll work through it." The seconds stretched, out like hours. Riley's mind raced as she tried to piece together what little she knew about Hesperis. The planet had been a mystery to them from the start. Their colony had landed here, not because of any grand plan, but because it was one of the few habitable planets within their reach. There had been no great discovery, no ancient warning from some lost civilization, just a barren world with a pulse beneath its surface, a pulse they had tapped into for survival, but now it seemed like the planet itself had its own plans. Riley closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down on her chest. She had always been a soldier, trained for battle, prepared for loss, but now the war wasn't just against the kaiju or even the planet's core. It was a fight for understanding, a fight for the truth. "I've got something." Jackson's voice snapped her back to the present. "There's a file here, older than anything we've seen before. It talks about the Guardians of Hesperis. These were creatures created, no, not created, evolved over millennia to protect the core." Riley's eyes snapped open, her heartbeat quickening. Guardians of Hesperis. The kaiju were more than just creatures. They were something ancient, something built into the very fabric of the planet. "Guardians," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Jaxon didn't answer immediately. She could hear his fingers flying across the keys. "This file, it's not clear, it's fragmented. But it seems like the core was never meant to be mined, not like we've been doing. It was always meant to remain untouched. And the kaiju, well, they were here long before we arrived. They were the protectors of this place, the keepers of the balance." Riley's chest tightened. "What do you mean, balance?" "It says here that the core's energy is more than just a power source," Jaxon continued. "It's the lifeblood of Hesperis. Every creature, every plant, even the land itself, everything is tied to it. The kaiju are connected to it. Their existence is bound to the core. If we continue extracting the energy like we have been, the core will destabilize, and the planet will die. The kaiju are the last line of defense. They're trying to stop us from draining it dry." Riley blinked, her mind struggling to make sense of this new information. "So, we've been draining the core, but not just for the mechs. We've been draining the planet itself, and the kaiju are trying to stop us." "That's the gist of it," Jaxon replied. "The core isn't a resource to be used. It's a living, breathing part of Hesperis, and now we're at a tipping. A point! If we don't stop, the planet will collapse in on itself." Riley took a deep breath, her hands tightening around the controls of the beacon. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It was a fight for the future of the planet itself. The creatures they had been battling for months were not their enemies, but the guardians of a system they hadn't understood. And now, it was clear they had been using the energy of Hesperis with no regard for the consequences. She swallowed, trying to steady her racing heart. "Jaxon, is there any way to fix this? Can we save the planet without destroying the core?" There was a long pause, and Riley could hear the frustration in Jackson's voice when he spoke again. "I'm not sure. The technology we've used to harness the core's energy was never designed for this. The mech systems were never meant to function without a constant flow of power. If we try to pull back, to regulate the flow, the whole thing could short-circuit. We could lose everything, the colony, the beacon, everything." Riley's mind raced. The situation was dire. They couldn't keep using the energy to fight the kaiju, but stopping would risk everything. They were caught between two impossible choices. "Then we have to find another way," she said firmly, her voice resolute. "We have to figure out how to save the planet without destroying it." Jackson's response was quiet, but filled with grim determination. "I'll dig deeper into the archives. There has to be a way to control the core's energy without killing the planet." As Jackson continued his work, Riley looked out across the battlefield. The kaiju had begun to shift their tactics, moving with greater coordination. They were no longer charging recklessly. They were forming a perimeter around them, pushing the beacon toward the center of the valley. And in the distance, Riley could see more of the creatures gathering. It was clear that they weren't just fighting a battle. They were being herded, corralled. The kaiju were guiding them, drawing them closer to something. "What are they doing?" Riley muttered under her breath. "They're trying to push us toward the heart of the core," Jackson replied, his voice strained. "I found another piece of data. It says the Guardians of Hesperis have a ritual of sorts, something to restore balance when the core's energy is being depleted. But it's not clear how it works." Riley felt a pang of hope flare up in her chest, quickly followed by doubt. A ritual to restore balance? It sounded almost too fantastical to be true. But then again, nothing about this planet had been straightforward from the start. And if there was any chance of saving Hesperis, they had to explore it. "Ritual?" she asked, her voice tight. "What does it entail?" Jackson hesitated before responding. "It says here that the Guardians, these kaiju, they can channel the energy of the core back into the planet. But it's dangerous. They would have to sacrifice themselves to do it. There's no record of anyone attempting it in modern times, and it's unclear whether it would even work." The words hit Riley like a blow to the chest. Sacrifice themselves. The Guardians, these kaiju, they weren't just creatures. They were tied to the core. They were part of it, and in the end, they were willing to give everything to save it. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. "The kaiju are not attacking us to destroy us," she said, the realization dawning on her. "They're trying to make us understand. They're trying to show us the cost of our actions." Jackson was silent for a moment before he spoke again. "And if we don't stop, they'll do whatever it takes to stop us themselves." Riley's heart sank. She understood now. The kaiju weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting for the life of Hesperis itself. The planet wasn't just their home. It was a living, breathing entity. And if they didn't change course, they would destroy it. The battle was far from over, but Riley finally understood what had to be done. She had one choice: stop fighting or risk losing everything. Riley's hand hovered over the control panel of the beacon, her mind swirling with the gravity of the choice she had just uncovered. The kaiju were no longer faceless enemies to be vanquished. They were the planet's last hope. The Guardians, as Jackson had uncovered, were not creatures born of malice, but protectors, bound to the core of Hesperis. They had been here long before humanity had arrived, and now they were desperate to protect the only thing that kept the planet alive. But Riley was stuck, paralyzed by the realization that the mechs, the very machines they had used to fight, the kaiju to keep the colony safe, were the instruments of destruction. The more they fought, the more they drained the core, the more unstable Hesperis became. And if they didn't stop, the planet would implode, tearing everything apart. The beacon hummed beneath her fingertips, the steady pulse of the mech systems at odds with the chaos in her chest. She couldn't look at the battle anymore. She couldn't focus on the mechs or the kaiju or the colony. There was only one thing that mattered now: how to stop the destruction and save Hesperis before it was too late. "Jaxon," she said, her voice barely a whisper as she glanced at the dim screen in front of her. "What if there's no way out? What if we can't stop it?" Jackson's voice crackled through her earpiece. "We have to try, Riley. We have to stop draining the core. If we don't, everything ends. Not just for us, for everyone on this planet. The kaiju are trying to protect it. We need to find another way." Riley felt the weight of his words settle on her like a burden too heavy to bear. If they stopped fighting, if they stopped using the core's energy, there was no guarantee the mechs would survive. And without the mechs, they had no way to defend themselves, no way to protect the colony. Her thoughts flashed back to the countless missions she had led, the battles she had fought, and the friends she had lost. Every decision she had made, every order she had given, had been driven by one core principle: survival. But now survival felt hollow. What was survival if it meant destroying the very planet they had come to call home? What was survival if it meant wiping out the last remnants of a world that was, in the end, alive? Another tremor shook the beacon, and Riley jolted in her seat. The kaiju were closing in again, this time more coordinated, more relentless. They were pushing her toward the center of the valley, toward the heart of the core. "I don't know if we have much time," Jaxon said, his voice strained. "The core's energy output is spiking again. If we don't act now—" Riley didn't need him to finish the sentence. She could feel it too. The atmosphere was thick with the pressure of the energy building beneath the surface, and the kaiju were closing in, making it clear that they weren't just attacking, they were pushing her towards something. A place, the heart of the planet where everything began. She glanced at the data that Jaxon had uncovered, the file on the Guardians, the ancient protectors of the core, the ritual, the sacrifice. The truth was clear now. The planet wasn't a mere resource to be exploited. It was alive, and the kaiju were the guardians of that life. They were trying to stop the destruction before it was too late. Riley closed her eyes and took a deep breath, the weight of the decision pressing on her chest. She could keep fighting. She could keep using the beacon to battle the kaiju, to protect the colony, but that would mean draining the core even further, destabilizing the planet, and ultimately destroying everything. Or she could stop. She could lay down her weapons, cease the fight, and find a way to restore balance. But that meant risking the colony, risking everything they had fought for. She could never forget the faces of the people back home, the families, the children, the civilians, who depended on her leadership, on her decisions. And stopping the fight now would mean putting them in danger. Would they understand? Would they forgive her? The kaiju surged forward, their massive forms silhouetted against the fiery orange glow of the sky. They weren't just attacking now. They were surrounding the beacon, forming a perimeter as they moved closer, as if guiding her toward the center of the valley, toward the heart of the core. Riley knew what they wanted. The kaiju weren't mindless beasts. They were intelligent, purposeful, and now it was clear that they were trying to communicate something. They were trying to show her the truth. But could she trust them? The thought gnawed at her. They had been enemies for so long, and it was hard to just turn that off, to see them as anything other than monstrous invaders. And yet, now it seemed as if they were the ones who were trying to protect the planet, the ones who understood what was truly at stake. "Jaxon," Riley said, her voice steady but quiet, "I'm going to stop the fight. I'm going to stop using the core's energy. But I need you to help me. I need you to find a way to restore balance before we lose everything." "I'll do everything I can," Jaxon replied, his voice urgent but filled with determination. "But Riley, if this doesn't work, if we can't fix the core—" Riley nodded grimly. "I know. The choice was made." She powered down the beacons, weapons systems, disengaging the rail guns, the plasma cannons, and the energy shields. The sudden silence inside the cockpit was deafening. The thrusters, usually roaring with life, hummed softly as the mech came to a gentle halt. The kaiju, sensing the change, paused too. For a moment, the chaos of battle gave way to a tense stillness. Riley's eyes flicked over to the massive creatures surrounding her. They stood like ancient sentinels, their eyes glowing with an eerie, almost mournful light. They weren't attacking, they weren't charging forward, they were waiting for her to make the next move. Jaxon's voice came through her earpiece. Again, quieter this time. "Captain, I've found something. There's a network of conduits beneath the surface. It connects the core to the kaiju. It's how they draw their strength. They're not just protectors, they're part of the planet's life force. And I think—" Riley held her breath, waiting for him to finish. "I think," Jaxon said, his voice filled with uncertainty but also hope. "If we can access these conduits and channel the energy back into the core, we might be able to restore the balance. We might be able to stabilize the planet before it's too late." Riley exhaled slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was the only chance they had. She took a final glance at the kaiju surrounding her, their forms towering like living mountains, their eyes locked on hers. This was it. The moment of truth. Riley gripped the controls with steady hands, her mind made up. She had one final decision to make, and this time, it wasn't about survival. It was about saving everything she had come to love, everything they had. "All fought for, Jaxon," she said, her voice firm. "Let's do it." The world around Riley had gone quiet, the cacophony of battle replaced by an eerie stillness. The kaiju, those massive, ancient creatures, had stopped their assault. They were no longer enemies to fight, but allies, standing in a circle around. The beacon like silent guardians, watching her with what could only be described as patience. The beacon was powered down, its systems humming at a low idle. The energy reserves now stable, but unstable at the same time. The core's fluctuations had begun to slow, but the damage done was irreversible. The balance had been disturbed for too long. The kaiju had already sacrificed so much to protect Hesperis, and now it was her turn to do the same. "Jaxon," Riley said, her voice steady despite the weight of everything that had transpired. "Are you ready?" The transmission crackled. For a moment before Jaxon's voice came through, more strained than before. "I've got access to the conduit system beneath the surface. The energy from the core is coursing through the kaiju, but it's unstable. If we don't stabilize, soon the entire planet will collapse." Riley's eyes flicked to the kaiju that surrounded her, each one standing like a living monument, as if they had known this moment was coming. Their glowing eyes pulsed with the rhythm of the planet's heartbeat, a heartbeat that was slowing. With every passing second, it was clear now that they had been waiting for her to make the ultimate decision. They knew the cost. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing on her, pulling her under. This wasn't just about the survival of the colony anymore. It wasn't even just about the beacon or the mechs. It was about Hesperis itself, the planet they had fought so hard to protect, and the choice was hers. Continue exploiting the planet's life force and risk its destruction, or stop, find a way to restore the balance and hope that they could save what was left. The planet was alive, but it was dying, and no one, neither the kaiju nor humanity, could survive without sacrifice. "Jaxon, I need you to run the override sequence," Riley said, her voice sharp, her hands tightening on the controls. "Get me into the conduit system. I'm going to channel the core's energy back into the planet." "You're sure about this?" Jaxon asked. the edge of concern evident in his voice. "We don't know if this will work. It's dangerous. There's no guarantee." "I don't have a choice anymore," Riley replied, her voice resolute. "This is the only way. I need you to trust me." A brief silence followed before Jackson's voice came through once again, steady and filled with resolve. "All right, I'm running the override. You just make sure you're ready." Riley didn't respond, but she knew what she had to do. She took a deep breath, feeling the familiar weight of her command settle into her bones. She wasn't just a captain anymore. She wasn't just a soldier. In this moment, she was Hesperis's last hope. The weight of the planet's survival rested on her shoulders, and it was a burden she was willing to bear. Her fingers moved across the controls, activating the energy conduits that ran through the mech. The faint hum of the beacon shifted, and the energy began to surge, but this time it wasn't focused on battle. It was focused on restoration. She felt the power of the core pulse through her, like an electric current shooting through her veins. And for a brief moment, everything inside her, a lifetime of fighting, of pain, of loss, faded away. For the first time, she wasn't fighting against the planet, against the creatures who had become enemies. She was with them. She was working with the kaiju, trying to heal what they had all broken. The mech systems flickered as the flow of energy began to change. The conduits under the surface hummed to life, and Riley's hands tightened on the controls as she guided the energy flow back into the core, channeling it through the conduits to stabilize the pulse of the planet. The kaiju moved as one, their massive bodies shifting in time with the flow of energy. They too were part of this delicate balance, part of the system that kept Hesperis alive. Their movements were slow, deliberate, as though they were working in unison with Riley and the beacon, each step bringing them closer to the heart of the core. Suddenly, a violent tremor rocked the beacon. Riley's teeth rattled as the mech struggled to stay upright. The control panel flashed with warnings as the flow of energy surged, then stuttered. "Jaxon!" Riley shouted over the comm. "What's happening?" "I'm trying to stabilize the flow, but it's too unstable." Jackson's voice was frantic. "I can't maintain the connection to the core. The kaiju, they're giving too much energy to the system. It's overloading. Riley's mind raced. The kaiju were pushing the limits of the core, trying to restore the balance, but they were also pushing the beacon and the conduit system to their breaking point. The energy was too much, too fast. The system was collapsing. The ground beneath her began to quake violently, and Riley braced herself against the tremors. The beacon groaned as the mech's hull strained under the pressure of the energy surging through it. Every fiber of the machine screamed in protest as the flow of power from the core surged higher, threatening to tear everything apart. "Jaxon!" Riley shouted again, her voice breaking through the static. "If we don't stop this—" "I know," he cut her off. "We need to pull back, but there's nothing left. The energy is beyond our control." Riley's eyes locked onto the kaiju. Around her, they were no longer just towering figures. They were part of something greater. They had already sacrificed so much. The power they were channeling was killing them, just as it was killing the planet. She realized then what she had to do. She was the one who had to make the sacrifice. The energy around the beacon surged again, and Riley felt the weight of the planet itself pressing on her. If she didn't stop the flow now, Hesperis would tear itself apart. There was only one way to restore balance, one way to stabilize the core, and it would cost her everything. "Jaxon, I'm going to do it," Riley said, her voice steady but filled with the gravity of her decision. "I'm going to release the energy. I'm going to let it all go." "No, Riley, you can't." "I have to. The kaiju can't do this alone. I have to do my part." Her fingers flew over the control panel as she initiated the release sequence. The beacon systems hummed as the energy began to pour out, the power surging into the conduits and down into the heart of the core. The kaiju responded, their bodies shaking with the strain, but they didn't falter. They were not alone anymore. Riley felt the flow of energy shift, first as a trickle, then as a flood. Her entire being was connected to the pulse of Hesperis, to the heart of the planet itself. The world around her cracked and trembled, and she could feel the planet's final breath coming, but she held on, anchoring the energy where it needed to go. She wasn't just releasing the energy, she was giving it back, sacrificing herself, so that Hesperis might live. And then, just as the final surge of power was about to break the planet's back, there was a sudden stillness. The ground stopped shaking. The kaiju ceased their movements, their massive bodies standing motionless, and the flow of energy stabilized. For a moment, everything was silent. The core had been stabilized. The kaiju had been saved. Hesperis, at least for now, had been given a chance. But as Riley's vision blurred and her consciousness began to fade, she knew the cost. She had given everything, her strength, her life, her soul, to save the planet, and she could only hope that it was enough. Riley's eyes fluttered open to an unfamiliar quiet. The vibrations beneath the beacon had subsided, and the constant hum of the mech's systems had stopped. She wasn't sure how much time had passed since she had made the sacrifice, since she had released the energy that had bound her to the planet's core. The world outside the cockpit was still, stiller than it had been since they first arrived on Hesperis. She blinked, her mind sluggish as if trying to catch up with her body. Her vision swam as the events of the past few hours slowly came back. To her, Jaxon's frantic warnings, the kaiju's desperate movements, and the excruciating choice she had made. She had channeled the core's power, given it all back in one final act of hope. But had it worked? The soft chime of a notification came through her comms, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Jaxon. Riley. His voice was softer than usual, filled with awe. You did it. The core is stabilizing. The flow of energy is balanced out. The planet, it's healing. The kaiju are retreating. He paused, and she could hear the disbelief in his voice. They're going back to their territories, the ones closest to the core. It's like they know. We've done our part. Riley's heart gave a slow, steady thud in her chest. The kaiju, the guardians, they had accepted her sacrifice. They had allowed her to restore what had been lost. A flicker of movement outside the cockpit caught her eye. She turned her head slowly, her muscles aching with every motion. But when her eyes met the landscape outside, she saw a world that was almost unrecognizable. The once chaotic skies were now clearing, a pale blue light beginning to break through the dark clouds. The air, thick with tension and unstable energy just hours ago, now felt crisp and fresh. Hesperis was breathing again, but there was something else. A distant rumble echoed across the valley. It wasn't the kaiju, it wasn't the core. It was something different, something alive. The ground beneath the beacon rumbled again, but this time it felt different. More like a pulse, more like the heartbeat of the planet itself. Riley's eyes widened as the ground ahead of her cracked open, a faint glow seeping through. It was then she saw it, emerging from the earth, not in the form of destruction but creation. A new mountain began to rise from the center of the valley, its jagged peaks reaching up toward the sky like the fingers of the earth itself. The glow that emanated from it wasn't the orange-red of molten destruction, but a calm blue light, soft and welcoming, like the planet had given birth to a new center of life, the core. Riley breathed, as if saying the words aloud would make it more real. She tapped into the systems of the beacon to gather more information. The energy levels were fluctuating, yes, but in a controlled manner. The new formation wasn't a sign of imminent collapse. It was a rebirth, a restoration of balance. The Guardians, Riley whispered, her hand resting on the control panel as she slowly took in the scene. The kaiju had returned to their positions, standing in silent reverence as they observed the change. Their towering figures, once threatening, now felt like protectors, guardians of a new future for Hesperis. "I can't believe it." Jaxon's voice came through again, this time with a slight quiver. It's working. You did it. We did it." A warmth spread through Riley's chest, though the exhaustion weighed heavily on her shoulders. Her body still felt the strain of the immense energy she had released. It had taken everything. Her strength, her will, and the essence of the beacon itself. But it was done. The core was stable, and Hesperis had a future. But it wasn't just Hesperis that had been saved. The connection she'd formed with the planet, the bond forged through the pain and the battle, had transformed her. She was no longer just a soldier, a commander. She was a part of Hesperis, and Hesperis was a part of her. Her fingers hovered over the controls as she processed what to do next. There was still so much to be done. The colony had to be rebuilt. The remaining mechs needed to be repaired and repurposed for the new era that was dawning on the planet. And above all, they had to learn from what had happened. They had to find a way to live in harmony with the planet, to honor the kaiju and the guardians who had shown them the true meaning of sacrifice. "We need to go back to the colony," Riley said, her voice filled with a quiet resolve. "The work's not over yet. We have to help them understand what we've learned. Hesperis is alive, but we have to respect it." Jaxon's voice was stronger now, full of agreement. "You're right, and there's more to do. There's a whole planet out there we haven't even begun to explore. The kaiju, those guardians, they'll need us just as much as we'll need them." Riley nodded slowly, gazing out at the new mountain, at the landscape that had been transformed before her eyes. The world was not the same as it had been. It was fragile, still scarred, but it was no longer dying. It was living. With a deep breath, Riley engaged the thrusters on the beacon and began to move toward the horizon, toward the distant colony. The journey was far from over. It was only just beginning, and as she moved forward, side by side with the kaiju, those once feared guardians of Hesperis, she realized that the true battle wasn't about survival anymore. It was about understanding. It was about learning, to live in harmony with the world around them, to honor the delicate balance that had been restored. The dawn of a new era had come, and Riley Shaw was ready to face it head on.